The morning air at Riverside Community Market carried the particular quality that only existed in the hours just after dawn, when the dew still clung to canvas awnings and the first vendors were pulling their trucks into position along the 3-block stretch that had once been the commercial heart of this Detroit suburb. Thaddius Brennan's pickup truck, a 1997 Ford F-150 with rust eating through the wheel wells and a transmission that complained about second gear, rolled into the same spot it had occupied every Saturday and Sunday for the past 8 years. The spot wasn't officially reserved, but the unwritten rules of the market meant that after a certain number of years, a vendor's place became as fixed as if it had been carved into stone. At 72 years old, Thaddius moved with the particular careful precision that came from a body that had been both powerful and punished in equal measure. His joints, especially the knuckles on both hands, announced themselves with sharp reminders whenever the barometric pressure dropped, which in Michigan meant most days between October and April. This morning in late June promised heat later, but for now the temperature sat at a comfortable 68 degrees, perfect for the physical work of setting up a produce stand. He'd been awake since 4:30, not from an alarm, but from the internal clock that hadn't adjusted to retirement even after 8 years away from the Ford River Rouge plant, where he'd spent 38 years of his life. In those days, he'd risen at 4 to make the 40-minute drive from his house on Elm Street to Dearborn, fighting traffic with thousands of other men and women who built the trucks and cars that America drove. The plant had been more than a job. It had been an identity, a brotherhood, a daily test of endurance that left him exhausted but satisfied in a way that selling vegetables never quite matched. But the plant was in the past now, closed to him by a combination of age, automation, and the general decline of American manufacturing that politicians promised to reverse but never quite managed to address. His pension, negotiated by the UAW in better times, provided enough to keep the house and pay the utilities, but not much more. Social Security helped, but anyone who thought you could live comfortably on Social Security alone had never tried to pay property taxes in a state where the government seemed to discover new fees every fiscal year. The vegetables came from the garden that stretched across most of his backyard, a quarter-acre plot that Margaret had started 20 years ago as a hobby and which had gradually expanded until it consumed most of their outdoor space. Margaret had possessed the genuine green thumb in their marriage, understanding intuitively which plants needed full sun and which preferred partial shade, when to prune the tomatoes, and how to keep the beetles off the beans without resorting to chemicals that would poison the soil. He'd learned from her through observation more than instruction, watching her work while he sat on the back porch after his shift, a beer in hand, and the evening news playing through the kitchen window. Margaret had been gone for 5 years now, taken by pancreatic cancer that moved so fast the doctors had barely finished explaining the diagnosis before they were discussing hospice care. 6 weeks from discovery to death, barely enough time to say goodbye properly, certainly not enough time to learn all the things about her garden that he wished he'd paid more attention to when she was healthy. The first year after her death, he'd let the garden go wild, unable to bear the sight of her carefully tended rows going to seed. But by the second spring, he'd realized that abandoning the garden felt like abandoning her memory. So he'd started again, making mistakes she never would have made, but gradually finding his own rhythm with the soil. The market had been Margaret's idea too, back when she was still healthy enough to help with the work. She'd read an article about farmers' markets experiencing a renaissance in American cities, young people rediscovering the appeal of local produce and handmade goods. "We could sell the extra," she'd said one evening over dinner, gesturing toward the window that overlooked their productive garden. "Make a little money and meet some people. You know you're going to go stir-crazy once you retire." She'd been right about that, as she'd been right about most things concerning his temperament and needs. Thaddius Brennan was not a man built for idle retirement, for golf courses and fishing trips and afternoon naps in front of the television. He needed purpose, structure, something to push against. The garden and the market provided that, though not in the way his work at the plant had. This was gentler work, but work nonetheless. Setting up the stall was a practiced routine that his body could perform almost without conscious thought. First, the folding table, purchased from Costco and reinforced with metal brackets after the original legs proved too flimsy for the weight of produce. Then the canvas canopy, forest green and emblazoned with Brennan's Garden Fresh Produce in white letters that Margaret had painted herself with stencils and steady hands. The wooden crates came next, salvaged from a restaurant supply company that was going out of business, sanded smooth and treated with linseed oil until they gleamed like furniture. Each crate had its designated produce, arranged with an eye toward both aesthetics and practicality. Tomatoes in the back left, where they'd catch the morning sun but be shaded by afternoon. Lettuce and leafy greens in coolers with ice packs hidden beneath decorative burlap. Root vegetables in the lower crates, where their earth-toned colors created a foundation for the brighter peppers and squash above. Margaret had taught him that people bought first with their eyes, that a beautiful display could command prices that a haphazard pile never could. By 6:30, other vendors were arriving, their vehicles ranging from beaten pickups like his own to newer vans with custom logos, advertising small businesses that existed somewhere between hobby and profession. The coffee vendor was always first, a young couple named Derek and Sam who roasted their own beans in a converted garage and whose presence was essential to the market's morning ecosystem. The smell of their brewing samples would drift across the market like a beckoning finger, drawing early customers who might have otherwise stayed in bed another hour. Next came the bakery contingent, 3 separate vendors who had carved out their own niches to avoid direct competition. Mrs. Chen specialized in French pastries that she'd learned to make during a year abroad in Paris 40 years ago. The Kowalski brothers did hearty Eastern European breads that could serve as meals in themselves, and Rainbow Bakery, run by a collective of 20-somethings with more enthusiasm than business sense, offered vegan and gluten-free options that Thaddius didn't quite understand, but which seemed to sell well enough to keep them coming back each week. The prepared food vendors followed, setting up their more elaborate displays with propane burners and griddles, generators humming to power, refrigeration units, and warming trays. The Mexican food truck, Abuela's Kitchen, claimed the corner spot where foot traffic from the parking lot was heaviest. The Thai family, whose name Thaddius had never quite learned to pronounce correctly, set up their tent with its distinctive purple awning. And Jorge, who made what he claimed were authentic Philadelphia cheesesteaks, despite having never lived east of Toledo, wheeled his cart into position with the confidence of a man who knew his customers didn't care about authenticity, as long as the sandwiches tasted good. But it was the arrival of Angela Rossetti that truly marked the beginning of Thaddius's market day. She pulled up in a white van that had seen better decades, its sides decorated with a fading mural of the Italian countryside that her late husband Vincent had painted himself. Angela was somewhere in her early 60s, though she carried herself with the energy of someone younger, her movements quick and purposeful, as she unloaded containers of fresh pasta and jars of sauce that she'd been making since 4 that morning. Angela had started coming to the market 3 years ago, 6 months after Vincent's death from a heart attack that had taken him at his workbench, where he'd been repairing a customer's watch. Vincent had been a watchmaker, one of the last in the city who could repair mechanical timepieces, and his death had left Angela not just widowed, but without the business that had sustained them for 35 years. The pasta had started as grief therapy, something to do with her hands while her mind processed the loss, but it had evolved into a small business that gave her reason to get up each morning. Thaddius had been drawn to Angela from her first day at the market, recognizing in her the particular combination of grief and determination that marked recent widows and widowers trying to build new lives from the rubble of their old ones. He'd helped her set up her display that first morning when she'd struggled with a canopy similar to his own, and they'd fallen into an easy rapport that had grown into something more substantial over the months and years that followed. Their stalls faced each other across the narrow aisle that ran down the center of the market, close enough for easy conversation, but far enough apart to maintain the professional boundaries that seemed important in the early stages of their friendship. They'd developed a rhythm of interaction, checking in with each other between customers, sharing observations about the weather or the crowd or the other vendors with the comfortable familiarity of long-married couples, though neither would have acknowledged that comparison. "Morning, Thad," Angela called out as she arranged her containers of pasta in neat rows, each variety labeled in her careful handwriting. "How are the tomatoes looking today?" "Best of the season," he replied, his voice carrying the warmth that seemed to appear naturally whenever he spoke to her. "Picked them yesterday evening when the light was just right. The Cherokee purples are particularly good this week." She smiled at that, the kind of expression that transformed her face from merely pleasant to genuinely beautiful. Angela had the classical Italian features that Hollywood had spent decades trying to replicate with makeup and lighting. Strong nose, expressive eyes, skin that had maintained its olive tone despite decades of Michigan winters. But it was her smile that caught him, the way it seemed to originate not from her mouth, but from somewhere deeper, a wellspring of warmth that hadn't been extinguished by loss. "Save me some of the good ones, will you? I'm making sauce tonight for the church dinner tomorrow." Father Michael specifically requested my arrabbiata. "Of course," Thaddius said, already mentally setting aside his best tomatoes for her. "How many pounds do you need? Maybe 10? I'm expecting 40 people, and you know how Catholics eat." They both laughed at that, the easy laughter of people who understood each other's references and rhythms. Angela attended St. Joseph's, the Italian Catholic church that had served Detroit's Italian community for over a century. Thaddius wasn't Catholic, wasn't much of anything religiously since Margaret's death had shaken his already tentative faith, but he appreciated the way Angela's church provided her with community and purpose. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the market's first customers, early birds, who knew that the best produce went quickly and were willing to sacrifice sleep for quality. Thaddius recognized most of them: Mrs. Patterson, who bought vegetables for the senior center where she volunteered; Dr. Kumar, who claimed his wife sent him, but who Thaddius suspected came for the social interaction as much as the produce; the young couple with the baby, who were trying to eat organic on a teacher's salary and a non-profit wage. The rhythm of selling was second nature now, the patter of prices and descriptions, the careful handling of money with the same hands that could still feel the grime of the factory floor, despite years of scrubbing. He kept his prices fair, but not cheap, having learned that customers who wanted the lowest price would shop at Kroger or Walmart, while those who came to the farmer's market were paying for something more than just vegetables. They were buying a story, a connection, a sense of participating in something older and more authentic than the fluorescent-lit abundance of supermarket aisles. By 8 o'clock, the market was filling with its regular Saturday morning crowd, a mix of young families pushing strollers, older couples moving slowly but purposefully between vendors, and the occasional lost-looking tourist who'd wandered over from the nearby antique district. The sound level rose steadily, conversations blending into a general hum, punctuated by children's laughter and the occasional bark from dogs that their owners insisted were well-behaved, despite evidence to the contrary. It was into this comfortable chaos that Cody Patterson and his crew first appeared, though Thaddius wouldn't learn the young man's name until later. There were 3 of them, all in their mid-20s, dressed in the aggressively casual style that suggested they had nowhere important to be and wanted everyone to know it. Cody was the obvious leader, thick-set with the kind of aggressive confidence that came from never having been seriously challenged. He wore his hair in a fade that must have cost $40 at a barbershop, but which he touched constantly as if unsure it was still there. His companions, who Thaddius would later learn were named Blake Morrison and Tyler Nash, flanked him with the practiced formation of subordinates who'd learned their roles in the social hierarchy. They moved through the market with the particular energy of those looking for entertainment rather than shopping, their loud voices and laughter creating a bubble of discomfort around them that other customers instinctively avoided. Thaddius watched them from his peripheral vision, a habit developed over decades of working in environments where situational awareness could mean the difference between going home safely and ending up in the emergency room. The Ford plant had taught him to recognize trouble before it arrived, to read the subtle signs of aggression and instability in the way men carried themselves and interacted with others. In 38 years, he'd seen every type of troublemaker. The angry drunk who'd take a swing at anyone within reach, the bitter veteran who'd sabotage equipment to prove a point, the young hothead who mistook aggression for strength. These three reminded him of the last category, young men who'd grown up in relatively comfortable circumstances, but who felt somehow cheated by life, who believed the world owed them more than it had delivered. They stopped at various stalls, handling merchandise with deliberate carelessness, making comments just loud enough to be heard, but not quite loud enough to demand confrontation. At the bakery stand, Cody picked up one of Mrs. Chen's carefully crafted croissants, squeezing it until the delicate layers compressed, then put it back with a shrug when she asked if he'd like to purchase it. At the honey vendor's table, Blake opened several jars, sticking his finger in to taste, before declaring the product probably fake and moving on. It was petty harassment, the kind of behavior that existed in the gray area between rudeness and actionable offense. Vendors exchanged glances but said nothing, following the unwritten rule of small business owners everywhere. Don't make waves, don't create scenes, don't give troublemakers a reason to escalate. The market had no security, relying instead on the general civility of its patrons and the hope that problems would resolve themselves or move along. When they reached Thaddius's stall, he was helping a regular customer, Mrs. Williams, select green beans for her Sunday dinner. She was particular about her beans, wanting them firm but not too thick, fresh but not so young that they lacked flavor. It was the kind of careful selection that Thaddius appreciated, a customer who understood that good food required attention and care. $5 for a pound of green beans? Cody's voice cut through their quiet negotiation. That's highway robbery, man. You can get them for 99 cents at Walmart. Mrs. Williams looked uncomfortable, glancing between Thaddius and the young men who'd suddenly made her simple purchase feel like participation in some kind of confrontation. Thaddius continued filling her bag, his movements steady and unhurried. Walmart doesn't sell beans that were picked this morning, he said calmly, not looking up from his work. These were on the vine 6 hours ago. You're paying for freshness and quality. Now, sounds like you're paying for some old man's retirement fund, Blake added, picking up a tomato and squeezing it hard enough to leave fingerprints in the skin. Probably grows these in his backyard and charges premium prices to idiots who think local means something. Mrs. Williams completed her purchase quickly, her discomfort evident in the way she fumbled with her wallet and hurried away without the usual pleasantries. Thaddius watched her go, noting how the young men's presence had transformed a regular customer into someone eager to escape. It was a small violence, the kind that left no visible wounds but accumulated into something larger over time. Everyone's entitled to their opinion, he said finally, turning his attention to straightening his display where Blake had disturbed it. If you're not interested in buying, I'd appreciate it if you'd move along. I have other customers to serve. Tyler laughed, a sharp sound that carried no actual humor. Other customers? "Looks pretty dead to me, Grandpa. Maybe people are finally figuring out they're getting ripped off." They moved on then, but not before Cody picked up one of Thaddius's best tomatoes, a perfect Cherokee purple that weighed nearly a pound, and took a large bite from it like it was an apple. He chewed slowly, maintaining eye contact with Thaddius the entire time, then tossed the remainder into the trash can at the corner of the stall. "Mediocre," he pronounced loudly. "Definitely not worth $5 a pound." They walked away laughing, leaving Thaddius standing behind his display with his jaw clenched tight enough to make his teeth ache. The tomato in the trash represented not just destroyed produce, but hours of work, the planting, watering, weeding, waiting. It was Margaret's heritage variety, seeds she'd saved and nurtured for 15 years. The casual destruction of it burned in his chest like acid. Angela had watched the entire interaction from her stall, her dark eyes flashing with indignation. As soon as the young men were out of earshot, she crossed the aisle, her movements quick and agitated. "Thugs," she said, the word coming out like she was spitting out something bitter. "Nothing but thugs looking for trouble. You should report them to market management." "And tell them what?" Thaddius asked, retrieving the bitten tomato from the trash and examining it sadly. "That some young men were rude and destroyed one tomato. They'd laugh me out of the office." "It's harassment," Angela insisted. "Everyone saw it." "Everyone saw nothing," Thaddius corrected gently. "That's how it works. People mind their own business and hope trouble passes them by." Angela's expression suggested she wanted to argue further, but customers were approaching both their stalls, and the business of selling took precedence over discussions of justice and fairness. But throughout the morning, Thaddius caught her glancing over at him with concern, her protective instincts engaged in a way that would have been touching if he hadn't been so focused on controlling his own anger. The truth that Thaddius hadn't shared with anyone at the market, that he'd barely acknowledged to himself, was that the encounter had awakened something in him that he'd spent the last 5 years trying to bury. His hands, now calmly arranging vegetables and making change, had once been weapons, trained and conditioned to deliver damage with scientific precision. The boxing had started when he was 15, a gangly kid from the east side of Detroit who'd walked into Mickey's boxing gym because it was warmer than the streets, and Coach Mickey Goldstein didn't charge kids who were willing to work. He'd swept floors and cleaned equipment in exchange for training, learning the sweet science from a man who'd fought professionally in the 1950s before a detached retina ended his career. Mickey had seen something in young Thaddius, a combination of physical gifts and mental discipline that separated potential champions from the kids who just wanted to learn enough to defend themselves. He had reach, with arms that seemed too long for his frame. He had power that came from somewhere deeper than just muscle, and most importantly, he had the ability to remain calm under pressure, to think strategically while someone was trying to knock his head off. By 17, Thaddius was fighting in amateur tournaments throughout Michigan, then throughout the Midwest. He fought Golden Gloves, winning the Detroit Regional Championship 3 times and the State Championship twice. He fought in Chicago, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, anywhere Coach Mickey could find worthy competition. His record was impressive, 47 wins against only 3 losses, with 32 of those wins coming by knockout. They called him Iron Thad because of his chin, his ability to take punches that would have dropped other fighters. But also because of his demeanor, the way he entered the ring with the mechanical precision of someone punching a clock at work. He didn't showboat, didn't trash talk, didn't celebrate his victories with more than a raised glove and a nod to the crowd. He fought like it was a job, which in many ways it was. A job that might lead to something bigger if he could keep winning. There had been talk of turning professional, of following the path that had led Detroit fighters like Joe Louis and Sugar Ray Robinson to glory. Promoters had come to watch him fight, Men in expensive suits who talked about signing bonuses and title shots. But then, Margaret had gotten pregnant with their first child, and the Ford plant was hiring, and the choice between a steady paycheck with benefits and the uncertain world of professional boxing hadn't really been a choice at all. He'd kept training even after taking the factory job, getting up at 4 to run 5 miles before his shift, hitting the heavy bag in his garage until his knuckles bled through the wraps. He'd sparred on weekends, helping younger fighters prepare for their own tournaments, teaching them the tricks that Mickey had taught him. But gradually, the demands of family and work had pushed boxing to the margins of his life until it became something he used to do rather than something he was. Margaret had been relieved when he finally stopped fighting competitively. She'd never liked the boxing, had attended only a handful of his fights, and spent those with her hands covering her eyes more often than not. She worried about brain damage, about the accumulation of small traumas that wouldn't manifest until years later. She'd read articles about Muhammad Ali's Parkinson's disease, about fighters who couldn't remember their children's names by age 50. The birth of their second child had given him a graceful exit from the sport, a reason to hang up his gloves that didn't feel like quitting. But the training never really left him. Even now, at 72, his body remembered the movements, the way to pivot on the ball of his foot to add power to a punch, the way to slip a haymaker by moving his head just inches to the side. Sometimes, in the garage while moving boxes or in the garden while digging, he'd find himself shadow boxing, his hands moving in combinations that had been drilled into muscle memory decades ago. Left jab, right cross, left hook to the body, right uppercut. The symphony of violence that had once been his art. The week following the first encounter with Cody and his crew passed without incident. Thaddius hoped they'd found other entertainment, other targets for their particular brand of casual cruelty. But the next Saturday, they were back, arriving just as the market reached its peak morning crowd. This time, they seemed more focused, less random in their harassment. They'd identified the vendors who were least likely to fight back, the ones who operated on the margins of profitability and couldn't afford to lose customers or create scenes. They targeted the elderly Asian woman who sold handmade jewelry, picking up her delicate pieces with clumsy fingers and making jokes about cheap Chinese stuff, even though she was Korean and had lived in Detroit for 40 years. They hassled the young mother who sold organic soap, questioning whether her products were really organic, demanding to see certifications she didn't have with her, causing enough disruption that several potential customers walked away rather than wait. When they reached Thaddius's stall, he was ready for them, having watched their approach with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to anticipate trouble. He'd moved his most expensive produce to the back, out of easy reach, and positioned himself where he could intercept any attempts at casual destruction. "Back for more overpriced vegetables, Grandpa?" Cody asked, his tone suggesting he'd rehearsed the line on the way over. "Or are you finally ready to admit you're running a scam?" "I'm running a business," Thaddius replied evenly. "Just like everyone else here. If you're not interested in buying, I'd appreciate it if you'd move along." "It's a free country," Blake interjected, picking up a cucumber and making an obscene gesture with it that caused a mother to quickly steer her children away from the stall. "We can stand wherever we want." They stayed for 10 minutes, not quite blocking customers, but making their presence felt, commenting on prices and quality just loudly enough to create doubt in potential buyers' minds. Several regular customers approached, saw the situation, and decided to come back later or skip Thaddius's stall entirely. Each lost sale represented not just immediate income, but potential future business, as customers who found other vendors might not return. Angela watched from her stall, her expression growing darker with each passing minute. When a customer finally approached her for pasta, she served them with distracted efficiency, her attention clearly on the harassment happening across the aisle. Thaddius caught her eye and shook his head slightly, a message to let it go, to not get involved. But he could see her trembling with suppressed rage, her protective instincts at war with practical wisdom. The pattern continued for 3 more weeks, each Saturday bringing a new variation on the same theme. The harassment was careful, calculated to cause maximum disruption with minimum liability. They never quite crossed the line into assault or destruction of property that would justify calling the police. They operated in the grey area of legal but awful, the space where bullies had always thrived. Other vendors began to feel the impact. The market's atmosphere, usually cheerful and communal, became tense whenever Cody and his crew appeared. Vendors started packing up earlier, unwilling to risk confrontation. Customers began coming less frequently, the word spreading through social media and neighborhood gossip that the Riverside market had a problem element that management seemed unwilling or unable to address. Thaddius tried talking to the market management, a committee of local business owners who operated more on good intentions than actual authority. They listened sympathetically, promised to look into it, and suggested that perhaps the young men were just high-spirited and would eventually move on. The subtext was clear. Without actual crimes being committed, there was little they could do beyond sending strongly worded emails that would accomplish nothing. It was Angela who finally reached her breaking point, though not in the way anyone might have expected. On a humid Saturday in late August, she arrived at the market with a new determination, setting up her stall with extra care, arranging her pasta and sauces in a particularly attractive display. She'd made extra sauce the night before, staying up until 2 in the morning to prepare enough for what she hoped would be a busy day. The church had placed a large order for their annual fundraising dinner, and she needed the income to cover her property taxes that were due in September. The morning started well, with steady sales and several new customers drawn by the smell of her sauce samples. She was explaining the difference between her marinara and her arrabbiata to an interested couple when Cody and his crew arrived, earlier than usual and seemingly in particularly foul moods. Blake was sporting a black eye that suggested his harassment wasn't always successful, and Tyler kept rubbing his jaw as if it was sore. They bypassed their usual targets and came straight for Angela's stall, perhaps sensing vulnerability in the way she was alone with her display while Thaddius was helping load a customer's car with a large purchase of vegetables. Or perhaps they simply decided it was time to escalate, to push boundaries further and see what they could get away with. "What's that smell?" Cody asked loudly, wrinkling his nose theatrically. "Smells like something died." Angela ignored him, continuing her conversation with the couple, who were now looking uncomfortable. But Blake picked up a container of her marinara sauce, holding it up to the light as if examining it for contamination. "This stuff looks like it's been sitting out all day," he announced to anyone within earshot. "Probably loaded with bacteria. You could kill someone selling sketchy food like this." "That sauce was made fresh this morning," Angela said firmly, her accent thickening with stress. "I follow all health department guidelines. Everything is properly refrigerated and labeled." Tyler grabbed another container, opening it and sniffing dramatically. "I don't know, man. Smells kind of funky to me. Maybe we should report this to the health inspector. Save some innocent family from food poisoning." The couple Angela had been serving exchanged glances and quietly moved away, their interest in purchasing evaporating in the face of potential confrontation. Other customers who'd been approaching her stall veered away, the suggestion of contaminated food enough to override any interest in fresh pasta. "Please," Angela said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Please just let me work. I'm not bothering anyone." "You're bothering me," Cody replied, his voice dropping to something more menacing. "This whole setup bothers me. Foreign food made in who knows what kind of conditions, probably in some dirty kitchen that's never been inspected. This is exactly the kind of unsafe food handling that gives farmers' markets a bad name. "I am an American citizen for 35 years, Angela said, her English fracturing under stress. "My kitchen is cleaner than any restaurant. You have no right—" "Maybe you should stick to selling stuff that doesn't require actual cooking skills," Blake interrupted, still holding her sauce container. "Or better yet, maybe it's time to retire. Let younger people with actual business sense take over this spot." What happened next seemed to occur in slow motion, though it probably took only seconds in real time. Blake, gesturing broadly with the container of sauce, accidentally knocked into Angela's display table. The impact sent dozens of pasta containers sliding, and several jars of sauce tumbled to the asphalt, shattering and splattering their contents across the ground and onto Angela's white apron. The pasta packages that hit the ground were instantly ruined, health codes preventing the sale of any food that had touched the ground, even if still sealed. "Oops," Blake said with exaggerated innocence. "Guess I'm clumsier than I thought." Angela stood frozen, staring at the destruction of her morning's work, at the sauce spreading across the asphalt like blood, at the pasta she'd rolled out by hand at 4 that morning, now scattered and unsaleable. The financial loss was significant, probably $200 in product, but it was the humiliation that showed on her face, the cruel reduction of her work and effort to a mess on the ground while people watched and did nothing. "Maybe this is a sign, Grandma," Cody said, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet market. "Maybe it's time for you to retire. Stop embarrassing yourself trying to compete with real vendors." It was that word, Grandma, delivered with such casual contempt that finally shattered Thaddius's restraint. He'd been walking back from the customer's car, had seen the entire incident unfold, had watched Angela's humiliation with a growing rage that felt like pressure building behind a dam. The word triggered something primal, a protective instinct that bypassed 40 years of civilized behavior and went straight to the fighter he'd tried to bury. He moved toward them with a fluidity that belonged to a much younger man, his arthritis forgotten, his careful shuffle replaced by the balanced stride of someone who understood exactly how violence worked and how to deploy it effectively. The market seemed to hold its breath as he approached, vendors and customers alike sensing that something fundamental was about to change. "Cody," he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume. The young man turned toward him with an expression of amused surprise, clearly not expecting the old vegetable vendor to intervene. "What do you want, old man?" Cody asked, though something in Thaddius's bearing introduced a note of uncertainty into his usual bravado. "I want you to apologize to Angela," Thaddius said simply. "Then I want you to pay for the food you destroyed. Then I want you to leave and not come back." Blake burst out laughing, the sound sharp and mocking. "Or what? You going to beat us up with your walking stick? Call the cops on us for accidentally bumping into some pasta?" "I don't have a walking stick," Thaddius replied, and for the first time in 5 years, his voice carried the authority that had once commanded respect in boxing rings across Michigan. "And there was nothing accidental about what you just did." Tyler stepped closer, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate. At 6'2", he towered over Thaddius's 5'10" frame, and at 25, he had the thick musculature of someone who spent serious time in the gym. "Listen, Grandpa, I think maybe you should mind your own business and go back to selling your overpriced vegetables before someone gets hurt." "Someone's definitely going to get hurt," Thaddius agreed calmly. "The question is who?" The market had gone completely silent now, the usual chatter of commerce replaced by the electric tension of impending violence. Angela stood behind her ruined display, her hands clasped together, watching with an expression that mixed hope and terror in equal measure. Other vendors had stopped pretending to work, openly staring at the confrontation. Several people had their phones out, ready to record whatever was about to happen. "Are you threatening us?" Cody asked, his voice loud enough to establish himself as the victim if this went badly. Everyone heard that. This old man just threatened us. "I'm promising you," Thaddius corrected. "There's a difference. A threat implies uncertainty. A promise is something you can count on. Something in his tone, in the absolute confidence with which he delivered the words, made all three young men reassess the situation. This wasn't going according to their script. The old man was supposed to back down, to accept his helplessness in the face of their youth and aggression. Instead, he stood there with a calmness that suggested he'd been in this situation before and knew exactly how it would end. "You're crazy, old man," Cody said, but his voice had lost some of its edge. "You touch any of us, and we'll sue you for everything you've got." "Everything I've got wouldn't cover your legal fees," Thaddius replied, "but you're welcome to try." The standoff stretched for several seconds that felt like minutes. Thaddius stood perfectly still, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, his hands loose at his sides. To the casual observer, he looked relaxed, almost bored. But anyone who understood violence would have recognized the stance, the positioning that allowed for instant movement in any direction, the readiness that preceded explosive action. Cody threw the first punch out of frustration more than strategy, a wide, looping right hand that telegraphed its arrival like a weather forecast. Thaddius saw it coming from the moment Cody's shoulder dipped, read the trajectory and the twist of his hips, and responded with the muscle memory of 10,000 hours of training. He stepped inside the arc of the swing with footwork that would have made Coach Mickey proud, his left hand coming up to deflect the punch, while his right delivered a short, sharp uppercut to Cody's solar plexus. The punch traveled maybe 8 inches, but it carried the focus power of proper technique, driving up under the ribs to that nerve cluster that controlled breathing. Cody's eyes went wide as every bit of air exploded from his lungs. He doubled over, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, his diaphragm temporarily paralyzed by the precise application of force. He dropped to his knees, both hands clutching his midsection, his face turning an interesting shade of purple as he struggled to remember how breathing worked. Blake came at him from the side, swinging wildly with both hands, the kind of undisciplined flailing that worked in bar fights against drunk opponents, but was nearly useless against someone with actual training. Thaddius caught the first punch on his forearm, feeling the impact, but letting it slide off rather than absorbing the force. He pivoted on his right foot, a movement that looked almost like dancing, and drove a left hook into Blake's liver with surgical precision. The liver shot is one of boxing's most devastating punches when properly executed. The liver, packed with nerve endings and crucial for blood filtration, sends shutdown signals to the entire body when traumatized. Blake's nervous system essentially hit an emergency stop button. His legs gave out immediately, dropping him to the asphalt where he curled into a fetal position, groaning and clutching his side. He wouldn't be getting up for several minutes, and when he did, he'd be wishing he hadn't. Tyler, seeing both his friends down in a matter of seconds, abandoned any pretense of fighting technique and simply charged, probably thinking he could use his size and momentum to overwhelm the older man through brute force. It was the strategy of someone who'd never faced a trained fighter, who thought that strength and aggression were enough to win any physical confrontation. Thaddius read the charge like a large print book, stepping aside at the last possible moment while grabbing Tyler's outstretched arm. Using the younger man's momentum against him, he guided Tyler face first into the metal support post of Angela's stall. Physics did the rest. Tyler's forward velocity, combined with his inability to get his hands up in time, resulted in a collision that rang out like a church bell. His nose broke with an audible crunch, blood immediately streaming down his face as he slumped to the ground, his hands trying to stem the flow while his eyes watered from the pain. The entire confrontation had taken less than 30 seconds. Three young men who'd swaggered into the market full of confidence and cruelty were now on the ground, groaning and bleeding and trying to understand how their morning had gone so catastrophically wrong. Thaddius stood in the center of them, his breathing slightly elevated but not labored, his white hair barely mussed from the exertion. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the labored breathing and groans of the defeated bullies. Then someone started clapping, a single person at first, then another, then dozens of people applauding as if they'd just witnessed a particularly satisfying piece of street theater. Vendors who'd endured weeks of harassment, customers who'd been driven away by the uncomfortable atmosphere, all expressing their appreciation for justice delivered in its most basic form. But Thaddius didn't acknowledge the applause. He knelt down beside Cody, who was still struggling to breathe normally, his face pale with shock and pain. 47 wins, 3 losses, Thaddius said conversationally, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. Michigan Golden Gloves champion, 3 years running. They called me Iron Thad back when your fathers were learning to walk. Cody's eyes widened with understanding and a retrospective fear of what could have happened if the old man had really wanted to hurt them. Thaddius continued, his tone shifting from conversational to educational. You want to know the difference between then and now? Back then, I fought people who knew what they were getting into, who stepped into the ring by choice and understood the risks. You three picked on people you thought couldn't fight back, thinking there'd be no consequences. He stood up, looking around at the crowd that had gathered, making sure his words reached everyone who needed to hear them. I could have hit you harder, he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. I could have broken bones, done damage that would affect you for the rest of your lives. But I chose not to, because beating up bullies doesn't make you a hero. It just makes you another kind of bully. Blake was trying to sit up, still clutching his side where the liver shot had landed. Tyler remained slumped against the pole, blood dripping steadily from his broken nose onto his designer t-shirt. Cody had managed to get to his hands and knees, but seemed uncertain whether standing was a good idea yet. This is how it works from now on, Thaddius announced, his voice taking on the tone of a judge delivering a verdict. You three find somewhere else to spend your Saturday mornings. You leave Angela alone. You leave all the vendors alone, and you think real hard about whether picking on people who can't defend themselves makes you feel like the big, strong men you pretend to be. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief, one of the cloth ones that Margaret had insisted proper men should carry, and handed it to Tyler for his nose. The gesture was unexpected, a moment of kindness that somehow made the lesson more profound than pure violence would have been. Get your friend to a hospital, he told Blake, who seemed the most coherent of the three. That nose is definitely broken and needs to be set properly. And you, he looked at Cody, should probably get checked out too. Solar plexus strikes can sometimes cause complications. Cody finally managed to struggle to his feet, swaying slightly and still breathing in short, painful gasps. This isn't over, old man, he wheezed, but the words lacked any real conviction. Yes, it is, Thaddius replied with absolute certainty. It's completely over. You're going to leave now, and you're not coming back. And if I hear about you harassing anyone else at any other market in the city, we'll have another conversation. And next time, I won't be so gentle. The three of them limped away, supporting each other, Tyler leaving a trail of blood drops on the asphalt. Blake was basically carrying Cody, who still couldn't straighten up completely. They avoided eye contact with everyone they passed, their humiliation complete and public in a way that would follow them far longer than any physical injuries. As they disappeared into the parking lot, the market slowly came back to life. But it was different now, charged with an energy that hadn't been there before. People were talking excitedly, comparing what they'd seen, already beginning to embellish the story in the way that witnesses always do. Several people approached Thaddius to shake his hand, or pat his shoulder, but he deflected the attention, uncomfortable with being treated as a hero for doing something he'd promised Margaret he'd never do again. Angela was the one who reached him first, stepping carefully around the sauce stains and scattered pasta that still littered the ground. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, gratitude mixed with something else, something that might have been recognition of who he really was beneath the careful persona of the elderly vegetable vendor. "Thad," she said softly, "I can't believe... where did you learn to do that?" "Long time ago," he said simply, already kneeling to help her clean up the mess. "Different life, different person." But she grabbed his hands, stopping him from picking up the ruined pasta. Her fingers were warm and strong, calloused from years of kneading dough and stirring sauces. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for standing up for me, for doing what nobody else would do. I know that's not who you are anymore," she continued. "I can see how much it cost you to do that." "Maybe it's exactly who I am," Thaddius replied, meeting her eyes. "Maybe I've just been hiding from it for too long." They stood there for a moment, hands clasped among the ruins of her morning's work, two people who'd found each other late in life and were still discovering what that meant. Around them, the market was buzzing with excitement, the story already growing in the telling. But in their small circle of connection, there was only understanding and something that might have been the beginning of love. The cleanup took an hour, with several other vendors coming to help once they'd processed what had happened. The Korean jewelry maker brought paper towels and cleaning solution. The soap maker offered replacement containers for Angela's sauces. The Kowalski brothers gave her fresh bread to replace what had been contaminated by ground contact. It was the market community at its best, rallying around one of their own who'd been wronged. Patrick Donovan, who sold handmade furniture from the stall next to Thaddius's, helped him reorganize his vegetable display while sharing his own perspective on the confrontation. "I've been in a few scraps myself," Patrick said, his Irish accent still thick despite 40 years in Detroit. "But I've never seen anything like that. The way you moved, it was like watching a dance. Those boys never had a chance." "They had every chance," Thaddius corrected. "They had the chance to be decent people. They had the chance to leave others alone. They had the chance to walk away when I warned them. They chose not to take those chances." "Still," Patrick persisted, 47 wins. Golden gloves. Why didn't you ever mention it?" "Because it's not who I am anymore," Thaddius said, then reconsidered. "Or at least it's not all of who I am. That person, Iron Thad, he was someone who solved problems with his fists. After Margaret got sick, I promised her I'd find better ways." "And did you?" Patrick asked. "I thought I had," Thaddius admitted, "but sometimes the old ways are the only ways that work. Sometimes violence is the only language bullies understand." Market management arrived eventually, a committee of 3 local business owners who looked deeply uncomfortable with the situation. They'd heard various versions of the story, each more dramatic than the last, and weren't sure whether to censure Thaddius for fighting or thank him for solving a problem they'd been unable to address. "We can't condone violence at the market," the committee chair, a nervous man named Roger, who owned a nearby antique shop, said officially. "But we also understand that you were defending another vendor from harassment and destruction of property." "I was defending someone who needed defending," Thaddius said simply. "If that's against market rules, then maybe you need better rules." In the end, they issued what amounted to a non-statement, officially reminding all vendors that violence was not acceptable while privately expressing relief that the 3 troublemakers were unlikely to return. They also promised to look into hiring security for future markets, though everyone knew that budget constraints made that unlikely. As the market day wound down, and vendors began packing up their displays, Thaddius found himself the center of attention in a way that made him uncomfortable. Customers who'd barely noticed him before wanted to hear the story directly from him. Other vendors treated him with a new respect that had nothing to do with his vegetables and everything to do with what they'd witnessed. But it was Angela's response that mattered most to him. As they loaded their vehicles in the late afternoon heat, she invited him to dinner at her house that evening. "I want to cook for you," she said. "Real food, not market samples. And I want to talk about what happened today, about who you really are." The dinner invitation led to a meal of homemade pasta with the marinara sauce that had been destroyed that morning. She'd made extra, anticipating the church order. They sat on her back porch, overlooking the Detroit River, watching freighters navigate the channel while the sun set behind the industrial skyline of Windsor. "Vincent was a gentle man," Angela said, pouring them both wine from a bottle her late husband had been saving for a special occasion. "He never raised his voice, never raised his hand. I loved that about him, his gentleness, but sometimes I wondered what would happen if someone tried to hurt us, if he could protect me if he needed to." "And now you know I can," Thaddius said, though it wasn't a boast, just a statement of fact. "That's not what I mean," Angela replied. "What I saw today wasn't just that you could fight. It was that you chose when to fight and how much force to use. You could have destroyed those boys, but you didn't. You gave them exactly what they deserved, no more and no less. That's not just strength. That's wisdom." They talked late into the evening about their pasts, their losses, their hopes for whatever future remained to them. Angela told him about growing up in Italy, coming to America as a young bride, building a life with Vincent that had seemed like it would last forever until it suddenly didn't. Thaddius told her about the boxing, about Margaret's illness, about the promise he'd made and broken. "She would understand," Angela said when he expressed guilt about the violence. "Margaret would understand that you were protecting someone you care about." "Someone I care about," Thaddius repeated, tasting the words. "Is that what you are?" "I hope so," Angela replied. "I'm too old for games, Thad. Too old to pretend I don't feel what I feel. We found each other when we both thought that part of our lives was over. Maybe that's worth protecting." Their relationship deepened over the following weeks, shaped by the shared experience of the confrontation, but built on something more substantial. They began timing their market arrivals to help each other set up, sharing coffee from Derek and Sam's stand while the morning was still cool and quiet. They ate lunch together between customer rushes, sometimes at her stall, sometimes at his, creating a small island of companionship in the busy market. The story of the confrontation had spread through the vendor community and beyond, growing with each telling until Thaddius had taken on mythical proportions. In some versions, he'd fought off 5 attackers. In others, he'd been a professional boxer who'd fought Muhammad Ali. The truth was dramatic enough, but people seemed to need the story to be even bigger, to match their desire for clear victories of good over evil. 3 weeks after the incident, Cody Patterson appeared at the market again, but this time alone and with a very different demeanor. He approached Thaddius's stall early, before the crowds arrived, his posture suggesting someone who'd done some serious thinking. "I wanted to apologize," he said without preamble, "for everything. The harassment, the destruction of property, the attempted assault. All of it." Thaddius studied him for a moment, noting the healing bruises and the way he still held himself carefully, protecting his midsection. "Apology accepted," he said finally. "But I'm more interested in why you did it in the first place." Cody seemed surprised by the question, as if no one had ever asked him to examine his own motivations. "I don't know," he admitted. "Boredom, maybe? Feeling like everyone else had something figured out that I didn't. My dad owns a construction company, expects me to take it over, but I hate construction. I come to places like this and see people doing what they love, even if they're not getting rich, and it makes me angry. So you decided to destroy what they'd built. It wasn't that conscious, Cody said. We were just messing around, pushing boundaries. It got out of hand. It always does, Thaddius replied. That's the thing about cruelty. Its appetite grows with feeding. You start with small meanness and end up destroying someone's livelihood. They talked for another 10 minutes, and Thaddius found himself feeling something almost like sympathy for the young man. Cody was lost, angry at the world for not providing him with clear purpose, taking out that anger on people who'd found their own paths. It didn't excuse his behavior, but it explained it in a way that pure malice wouldn't have. Can I buy some vegetables? Cody asked finally. My mom always said the produce here was better than the grocery store. Thaddius sold him tomatoes and green beans, charging him the regular price despite Angela's suggestion from across the aisle that he should triple it. As Cody walked away with his purchases, Thaddius reflected on the strange turns that life could take, how violence could sometimes lead to understanding, how confrontation could clear the air like a thunderstorm. The market continued to thrive through the rest of the summer and into fall, the atmosphere lighter and more cheerful without the presence of troublemakers. New vendors joined, attracted by stories of a community that looked out for its own. Customers returned, feeling safe to shop without harassment. The market management even managed to hire a part-time security guard, though his presence was more symbolic than necessary. Thaddius and Angela's relationship evolved from companionship to something deeper, though neither rushed to label it. They began spending time together outside the market, visiting each other's gardens, sharing meals, attending the occasional seniors event at the community center. It was comfortable and comforting. Two people who'd thought their chances for romance had passed, discovering that life still held surprises. One evening in October, as they sat in Thaddius's backyard, watching the last tomatoes of the season ripen on the vine, Angela asked him a question that had been on her mind since the confrontation. Do you ever think about what would have happened if you'd become a professional boxer? If you'd chosen that path instead of the factory? Thaddius considered the question while sipping the wine Angela had brought, a red that Vincent had laid down 20 years ago for a special occasion that never came while he was alive. I used to, he admitted, especially during the bad years at the plant when my back hurt and my hands were so swollen I couldn't make a fist. I'd imagine winning titles, making money, being somebody that people recognized. And now I think everything happened the way it was supposed to. If I'd gone professional, I might have ended up punch drunk or dead. I wouldn't have had my children, wouldn't have had 40 years with Margaret, and I wouldn't be here now with you, selling vegetables and defending pasta makers from Bullies. Angela laughed at that, the sound rich and warm in the cooling evening air. My hero, she said, only half joking. I'm nobody's hero, Thaddius protested. I'm just an old man who remembered he used to be good with his fists. You're more than that, Angela insisted. You're someone who knows when to fight and when not to, how much force to use and when to show mercy. That's not just boxing training, that's character. As fall turned to winter and the market moved indoors to a local community center, Thaddius found himself reflecting on the changes that one moment of violence had brought to his life. He'd broken his promise to Margaret about never hurting another person, but he thought she would understand. Sometimes protecting good people required standing up to bad ones, and sometimes standing up meant being willing to knock down. The young men never returned to the market, though Thaddius occasionally saw Cody around town, and they'd exchange nods of mutual acknowledgement. Blake and Tyler had apparently moved on to other activities, hopefully having learned that there were consequences to treating people badly. The market had returned to its natural rhythm of commerce and community, the confrontation becoming part of its folklore, a story told to new vendors as both warning and reassurance. On a snowy Saturday in December, as Thaddius and Angela worked their combined indoor stall selling winter vegetables and dried pasta, Patrick Donovan stopped by with news that made them both laugh. "Did you hear?" he asked, barely containing his excitement. "Someone nominated you for the market's Vendor of the Year award. The committee's considering adding a special category for community protection." "That's ridiculous," Thaddius said, though he was smiling. "That's recognition," Patrick corrected. "People remember what you did. How you stood up when nobody else would. That means something." It did mean something, Thaddius realized. Not the potential award, which he would politely decline if offered, but the fact that the community had witnessed someone taking a stand against wrongdoing and had judged it righteous. In a world that often seemed to reward the cruel and punish the kind, it was a small victory for justice. As the market day ended and they packed up their goods, Angela slipped her hand into his, a gesture that had become natural over the months since the confrontation. "I've been thinking," she said, "about combining more than just our market stalls." Thaddius looked at her, reading the suggestion in her eyes. They were both in their 70s, both widowed, both presumably past the age where such decisions carried long-term implications. But standing there in the community center, surrounded by the remnants of their small businesses, he realized that age had nothing to do with the capacity for love or the desire for companionship. "Are you proposing?" he asked, only half joking. "I'm suggesting," Angela replied. "We're too old for long engagements and too practical for separate households. Your house or mine?" They discussed it over dinner that night, weighing the practical considerations of two people who'd lived alone for years, trying to merge their lives. His house was larger, but needed work. Hers was newer, but held more memories of Vincent. In the end, they decided on his, with plans to renovate the kitchen to accommodate Angela's pasta-making equipment. The wedding, such as it was, took place the following spring at the market, with vendors and regular customers serving as witnesses. Father Michael from Angela's church performed the ceremony between the vegetable stalls and the pasta display, with the smell of fresh bread and brewing coffee providing the atmosphere. Thaddius wore his only suit, the one he'd bought for Margaret's funeral and hadn't worn since. Angela wore a simple dress that she'd made herself, pale blue with small flowers that reminded him of Margaret's garden in full bloom. There was no reception in the traditional sense, just the normal market day with extra samples and free coffee courtesy of Derek and Sam. Customers who didn't know about the wedding wondered why everyone seemed so happy, why vendors kept hugging the elderly couple selling vegetables and pasta from adjacent stalls. "Do you regret it?" Angela asked him that evening as they sat in what was now their shared home, looking through the garden that would soon need planting. "Regret what?" Thaddius asked. "Marrying you? Breaking up the fight? Breaking my promise to Margaret? Any of it? All of it?" Thaddius considered the question seriously. The confrontation at the market had changed everything, broken his 5-year commitment to non-violence, revealed his past to the community, led to this unexpected second chapter with Angela. It had been a moment of choice that redirected the current of his life in ways he couldn't have predicted. "I regret that violence was necessary," he said finally, "but I don't regret protecting you. I don't regret showing those bullies that there are consequences to cruelty. And I definitely don't regret where it led us." Angela squeezed his hand, her fingers still strong from years of kneading dough. "Iron Thad," she said with affectionate mockery. "My hero." "Just Thad," he corrected. "Just an old man who grows vegetables and married a beautiful woman who makes pasta. And who can still knock out 3 troublemakers in 30 seconds, Angela added. "That too," Thaddius admitted, "but hopefully that's a skill I'll never need to use again." As spring turned to summer and the market returned to its outdoor location, Thaddius and Angela had become something of an institution. New vendors sought their advice not just about business, but about life. Regular customers brought their children to meet the couple who'd found love late in life, as if they were proof that good things could happen at any age. The story of the confrontation had evolved into legend, told and retold, with variations that Thaddius barely recognized. In some versions, he'd been a championship boxer who'd fought Joe Louis. In others, the young men had been armed with knives or guns. The truth that a 72-year-old retiree had defended someone he cared about using skills he'd learned 50 years earlier seemed insufficient for the human need for mythology. One Saturday in July, almost a year after the original incident, a young man approached their stall whom Thaddius didn't recognize at first. He was clean-cut, wearing a shirt and tie despite the heat, and he carried himself with a quiet confidence that seemed familiar. "Mr. Brennan," he said politely, "you probably don't remember me." "I'm Blake Morrison." Thaddius did remember then. Blake had been the one who'd taken the liver shot, who'd knocked over Angela's display. But this version of Blake seemed like a completely different person from the swaggering bully of a year ago. "I remember you," Thaddius said carefully. "I wanted to thank you," Blake said, which was not what Thaddius had expected. "That day what you did, it changed my life." He went on to explain that the confrontation had been a wake-up call. He'd realized he'd become someone he didn't like, someone his parents would be ashamed of. He'd gotten a job, gone back to school, ended his friendship with Tyler, who was still looking for trouble in all the wrong places. "Cody's doing better too," Blake added. "Took over his dad's construction company, but on his own terms. He credits you with teaching him about consequences." "I just defended my friend," Thaddius said, uncomfortable with being credited for transformation he hadn't intended to inspire. "You did more than that," Blake insisted. "You showed us that strength isn't about intimidating people weaker than you. It's about protecting them. That's a lesson I needed to learn." After Blake left, purchasing vegetables and pasta with sincere compliments about their quality, Angela looked at Thaddius with an expression of amused pride. "Still think you're not a hero?" she asked. "I think heroes are more complicated than we like to pretend," Thaddius replied. "I think sometimes doing the right thing requires doing things we wish we didn't have to do." "Philosophy from a boxer," Angela teased. "What's next, poetry?" "Don't push it," Thaddius warned with a smile. As the afternoon wore on and customers came and went, Thaddius reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this point. From the angry young fighter from Detroit's East Side to the factory worker trying to support a family. From the grieving widower tending his late wife's garden to the reluctant hero of a farmer's market. From solitary vendor to half of a partnership that had become the heart of the market community. The confrontation with the three young bullies had been a pivot point, a moment when the carefully constructed walls between his past and present had collapsed, forcing him to integrate parts of himself he'd thought were buried forever. Iron Thad and vegetable vendor Thaddius were the same person, just as the capacity for violence and the commitment to peace could exist in the same heart. "What are you thinking about?" Angela asked during a quiet moment between customers. "About how life surprises us," he replied. "About how the things we try to leave behind have a way of catching up with us. And sometimes that's exactly what needs to happen." "Very philosophical," Angela said, "but save the deep thoughts for later. We have customers." And they did have customers, a steady stream of people who came as much for the story as for the produce, who wanted to buy vegetables from the man who'd stood up to bullies and pasta from the woman he'd defended. It was a small fame, local and likely temporary, but it provided enough extra income to make their combined retirement more comfortable than either had expected. As the market day drew to a close and vendors began their familiar end-of-day rituals, Thaddius and Angela worked in comfortable synchronization. their movements coordinated by months of practice and an understanding that went deeper than words. They were partners in every sense, in business, in life, in the ongoing project of proving that it was never too late for new chapters. The sun was setting by the time they finished loading their van, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that reminded Thaddius of the bruises he'd left on Cody's ribs. But that comparison felt wrong somehow, too violent for the peace of the moment. Better to think of it as the same colors as Angela's tomato sauce, the one that had been spilled that day, but which now sold out every market day. "Ready to go home?" Angela asked, closing the van's rear doors. "Ready," Thaddius confirmed, though he took one last look at the market, at the place where everything had changed. It looked ordinary in the evening light, just a parking lot with some permanent stalls and temporary structures, nothing to suggest it had been the site of a confrontation that had altered multiple lives. But places, like people, contained hidden histories, moments of transformation that left no visible marks but changed everything that came after. They drove home through familiar streets, past the closed factories and renovated warehouses, past the urban gardens and empty lots, past all the evidence of a city that had been knocked down but refused to stay down. It was a fighter's city, Thaddius realized, a place that understood both violence and resilience, both loss and the possibility of unexpected second acts. At home, in the kitchen, Angela had reorganized to accommodate her pasta-making equipment. They prepared dinner together. It was a simple meal: fresh pasta with vegetables from their garden, bread from the Kowalski brothers, wine from Angela's seemingly endless collection of bottles Vincent had saved for special occasions. But it felt like a feast, enhanced by the satisfaction of a day's work done well and the company of someone who understood what that meant. "I love you," Thaddius said suddenly, the words surprising him with their appearance. He'd thought them many times but hadn't said them aloud, some part of him feeling like they belonged to Margaret alone. Angela looked at him with those dark eyes that had first caught his attention across the market aisle, eyes that had seen loss and hardship but still held warmth and humor. "I love you too," she replied simply. "Both parts of you, the gentle gardener and the iron fighter, the man who grows beautiful vegetables, and the man who knocked down 3 bullies in 30 seconds. They're both you, and I love them both." As they ate their dinner and talked about plans for the next market day, for the fall harvest, for the winter months when they'd work indoors, Thaddius felt a contentment he hadn't experienced since before Margaret's illness. It wasn't the same as what he'd had with his first wife. Nothing could be. But it was real and valuable in its own right. The confrontation at the market had been a moment of violence that he'd spent years trying to avoid. But it had also been a moment of clarity, revealing truths about himself and his community that might have remained hidden otherwise. Sometimes, he realized, the things we fear most are exactly what we need to face. Sometimes the promises we make need to be broken for better promises to be kept. Outside, night was falling over Detroit, over the riverfront and the abandoned buildings, over the gardens and markets where people like him and Angela tried to build something good from the materials at hand. It was a city that understood fighting, that knew sometimes you had to stand up and throw punches just to maintain your right to exist peacefully. Thaddius Brennan, 72 years old, retired auto worker, vegetable vendor, former Golden Gloves champion, and unlikely newlywed, sat with his wife in their small kitchen and felt grateful for all of it. The fights won and lost, the love found and lost and found again, the vegetables growing in the garden, the pasta drying on the racks, the future that stretched ahead for however long they had. The market would be there tomorrow and next week and next month, a constant in a world of change. And he would be there too, selling vegetables and protecting what mattered, no longer hiding from the fighter he'd been, but no longer defined by it either. Just Thaddius Brennan, complete and complicated, violent and gentle, exactly who he needed to be.